Okay, hello and welcome once again, to my home here in New Zealand. We're nearing the end of week 3 of the lockdown here in New Zealand. I know a lot of you are watching from India, and I heard that your lockdown has been extended until May the 3rd, is that right? So yeah, I guess all we can really try to do is stay safe and just hope that life can go back to some sense of normal in the not too distant future. But if this is the first time you've watched this is a series of webinars which I've been running during lockdown here. This is the 9th one that I'm doing today. Today we're going to be looking at grammar, in particular complex sentences. Let me introduce myself if this is the first time that you're watching. My name is Greg. I've been an English teacher for 15 years now. Most of that time was in Korea. Very familiar with academic English, having worked in universities and having tutored IELTS for a while now too. As I mentioned, today we're focusing on grammar. Grammar is a really big part of IELTS. It's actually one skill which isn't tested directly, but it will be part of all of the 4 tests, whether it be writing, speaking, reading or listening. You need to have a good understanding of grammar in order to do well. Especially with the 2 productive skills, speaking and writing, you need to produce complex sentences. Those are mentioned on the band descriptors for writing task 1, writing task 2, and on the speaking band descriptors. I'm not going to make any more references to those today, so you don't need to get those ready. You just need to come along and we're going to go through a worksheet. I'm going to start by introducing a little bit more of the concepts of complex sentences. You can find a worksheet on Facebook. That should be there now on the GRAID Facebook page. And also that is embedded directly into the GRAID site, which we can see right here. During the webinar, as always, please feel free to ask any questions. I have my computer open so I can see the questions which have been asked. And yeah, so if you have been watching, I hope all of those webinars on writing task 2 have helped. This will build upon your writing skills. And also, don't forget, it's going to help you in the speaking test. And you're likely to come across complex sentences on your reading test. Possibly, you might hear them in the listening test as well. So, let's go straight into it. Complex sentences. Okay, so the kinds of complex sentences we're going to look at today, here's a nice idiom. They're the garden variety of complex sentences. So they're the complex sentences which have an independent and a dependent clause. Let's start by having a look at an example of an independent clause. Now you've heard me, if you've watched, you've heard me talk about these in previous webinars. An example here, I passed the test. So if I came up to you on the street and I said, I passed the test, by standalone, that means that particular clause makes sense, right? You should be able to understand that. It has meaning by itself. A dependent clause is not, well, it's not the case with a dependent clause. So think about the same example. I came up to you on the street and I randomly said, because I studied hard, right? So you might be quite shocked. Why has this person come up to me and just said, because I studied hard? But if I put these 2 clauses together, we have a complex sentence. I passed the test because I studied hard. So again, I studied hard depends on the independent clause, right? So if you're not sure what a clause is, let me give you a simple example. I'll give you a couple. I am a teacher, right? So a clause will have a subject, right? So can you identify the subject in this clause? If your answer is I, well done. And here we have the be verb as our main verb. There's only one verb in this clause. I'll give you a few examples so you can really understand what clauses are. The reason I've chosen this example is because a lot of people get confused by what the main verb is in this clause. Obviously, same pronoun as the subject, but what is the main verb in this clause? If your answer is teaching, well done. So we're just going to put the verb here. Am is known as an auxiliary verb. All right, so one final example of a clause. I like cricket. Definitely no cricket here in lockdown, but I still like cricket. And here, the same subject. And in this case, our verb is like. So there are some examples of clauses. Again, with a complex sentence, we have two or more clauses. Today, we're just going to focus on two clause complex sentences. One of the clauses needs the other to be meaningful. That's what you should be trying to produce in your writing, especially, even when you speak. Now, I've told you these are the garden variety of complex sentences. On Thursday, we're going to look at some more types of complex sentences because you do need to give or demonstrate a wide range of grammar. But for now, what we're going to do we're going to focus on these complex sentences, which have what are known as subordinating conjunctions, right? So if you have the worksheet, and you don't need to have the worksheet in front of you, you'll see another expression which means the same thing, subordinator. And these are all the conjunctions which we're going to look at today to form complex sentences. One clause and another clause, one of the clauses depends on the other, right? So some of them give contrast, right? So you've seen me use these in previous webinars if you've been watching. Although, even though, while, these use contrast, although I will point out straight away that although, even though, and though show a stronger contrast. And we're going to examine the difference there later. Cause and effect, this is the one which many students are most familiar with. Because, but when you're speaking, when you're writing in IELTS, don't forget about since and as. Just to use a bit more variety, you can really, in most cases, use those interchangeably. We have all the time clauses, when, as soon as, before, after, by. And we're going to look at some conditionals or conditions, if and also unless. And in this webinar, I'm going to expand upon the different uses of if. There are 4 different conditionals, actually 5. I'm going to explain that as well. So let's jump into the worksheet. So the worksheet itself, if you have found it on the GRAID website or on Facebook, there are 10 questions we're going to focus on today. To make it easy for you at home, if you don't have the worksheet, I have it all up here, and it's a simple fill in the blank worksheet. What you're going to do, I'll give you a chance at home, decide which of these subordinating conjunctions we can use to complete the sentences. Now, in some cases, you'll be able to use more than one. So let's move on. Let's start with the first example here. So the government should prioritize spending on hospitals, and then we have a blank. So a subordinating clause, health is more important than the arts, right? So remember, complex sentences we're looking at today, 2 clauses, one of the clauses needs the other one, and it's linked with a subordinating conjunction, right? So take some time at home think about all the subordinating conjunctions that I showed you before, and I'll show you again to help you. What I'll do with the first one, just to give you some support, is I'm going to write them up on the, I'll write this up on the board, and then I'll flip back to the subordinating clauses. So the government should prioritize spending on hospitals Now, what I hope is as we progress through these 10 examples, I won't have to keep flipping back as often to the subordinating clause examples or the examples of them. If you need me to, though, don't be afraid to send me a message on Facebook, on the GRAID Facebook site. So if you want me to bring up anything that I've showed before, you can do that. I work on requests, right? So I'm going to leave this question on this side of the board, and I'm going to show the subordinating clauses again for you. So again, the subordinating clauses are all in black. Which one, or which ones, because there might be more than one possibility, can we use to complete this sentence? Take some time at home, think about that. I'll tell you the answer shortly. So if you answered because, well done. But remember, what I find, especially in writing and even when people speak, this word or this conjunction because is quite overused. So mix it up sometimes. You could also use since or as to complete this sentence, right? So that's a good tip just to give your speaking or writing a bit more variety. And like I said, in most cases, these can be used naturally, interchangeably, which means instead of using because, you could use as or you could use since. So in most cases, we're going to find it won't affect how natural your sentence sounds. But if that was your answer, well done. So it's an obvious use of cause and effect. So now I did mention before that one clause is dependent upon the other. In this case, this one is dependent upon the first clause. So in most cases, the example I gave you where somebody comes up to you randomly on the street and speaks the dependent clause, that clause would not make too much sense. I guess in this case, it's not as obvious, but imagine I came up to you and I said, health is more important than the arts. I guess you could say that that has some meaning by itself, but it definitely has greater meaning when we add it. We combine it with the subordinating conjunction to the independent clause, right? So let's move on to question 2. Now, have a good look at these again, review all of these subordinating clauses, because the next time I'm not going to write the question up on the board. I want to see how much you can remember. So again, if you do need me to show them, or if you want me to write up the second question, please ask me, but I'm hoping that you can start trying to remember these ones. Okay, so we're on to number 2. Many children only start to learn to read. This is where we need a subordinating clause, or conjunction rather. Subordinating conjunction, subordinator. They begin school. One more time. Many children only start to learn to read. What's missing? They begin school. Now, if you have watched all of the webinars, you'll recognize some of the content. I've drawn these sentences, composed these sentences based on essays which we've covered in previous webinars. But anyway, take some time at home. This one's going to be more difficult for you because I want you to try recall the best subordinator based on what you can remember from the presentation I just gave you or your own English proficiency, right? So a little bit more of a challenge for you. If you want me to write up this here and show you the subordinating conjunctions, please let me know. Otherwise, I really want to start challenging you a little bit more at home. Now here, I believe, and tell me if you disagree, here I believe that there are several answers. Now, these are the possible answers in my opinion. Sorry, I'll make that clearer so we know that this is question 2. When? We also could have as soon as, or even after, right? Obviously, there's a difference in meaning between when and after, but these are the possible answers, right? What I do not think is possible, and I think somebody has written before, many children only start to learn to read before they begin school. To me, that doesn't make sense, right? And the reason that doesn't make sense is because of the use of the adverb only. So without only, it might make sense, but to me, in this case, using before doesn't make logical sense. I have a question here about cause and effect, subordinating conjunctions. So I'm going to show those again for you. Now, somebody has mentioned for cause and effect, we could also have due to. Yes, absolutely. So by no means are these all of the subordinating conjunctions. These are just ones which I'm presenting today. But I really like your point, and I will absolutely add that. So yes, due to is totally fine to use. As I say, in most cases, you can use these interchangeably and it won't change how natural the sentence will sound. In some cases, you're not going to know that until you compose the sentence because of collocations or just the use of certain phrases which are set phrases. But I think it's fair to say that you can use these interchangeably and you should have a good sentence. So you can add due to that list. So thank you for pointing that out. Really appreciate some feedback. You may even think of others while you're going through these exercises. Let's move on to number 3. Now, here it is. We're missing one from the start. And what I also want to point out to you is the use of a comma, right? So I'll show you how it works. We have a subordinating conjunction here. Well, a clause, right? So this is the clause, comma. That's not very clear. So we have a comma, right? So hopefully you can see the comma here. And then we have another clause. Now, you might notice that with the example 1 and example 2, there is no comma. So think about that. Why do we have a comma here? I'll tell you the answer shortly, but what do you think's missing? Okay, if you see me go off screen, it's just I'm reopening my computer to make sure I don't miss anything that you might add. If you have answered if, well done, right? So maybe you answered it because you remembered this particular sentence from one of the previous webinars. Now, I will add that this is essentially, this is a recommendation. And in your writing, in particular writing task 2, this is the type of sentence I think you could offer as a recommendation as the last sentence in your conclusion. So definitely a really nice sentence to remember. It's a conditional sentence, right? So another subordinating conjunction we use with conditionals is unless, right? So there will be an example where one of the answers will be unless, but what I want to do at this point, just to expand upon the different types of sentences you could compose in your writing in the speaking test, is I want to explain a little bit more about this concept of conditionals, right? So again, conditionals are sentences, almost always they use if, sometimes unless, or there are other ways of phrasing if, but let's just say if sentences for simplicity. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there are actually 5 types of conditional sentences. And I want to explain these to you because, as you remember, as you should know, in the IELTS, you need to use a range of grammar, right? So especially, in your with your productive skills and the speaking and writing tests, you need to show off to the examiner that you have command of all these different grammatical structures. So with if sentences or conditionals, there are 5 different types. I'm going to give you an example for each. As we go through each one, I'm going to give you a chance at home to see if you can identify the form. Now, if you don't know what I mean by the form, I'll give you an example, or the same example again. So this form is the be verb, present tense be verb, right? So we have a subject, right? And we have the verb be, right? So the present form of be, right? So this is a simple way of representing form, right? So when we study grammar, often, or when we teach it, when we study it, we often divide grammar into form or function. So form means this. The function of be, just so you can follow, in this case, I'll put it in red. The function is, well, it's a state, right? So I'm describing a state. In this case, the state is a noun, right? So it's something or someone, right? So the be verb has a few different functions, but it's not an action. So it could be a noun, it could be an adjective, or it could be a place, a preposition, right? Think about this. I am a teacher. I am tall, right? So I'm describing using an adjective. I am from, preposition, New Zealand. Those are the functions of the verb be. And there is the form. The form means how we use it grammatically, right? So we need a subject. And with the be verb, it changes depending on that subject. I am, you are, we are, they are, he is, she is, it is. Those are with the different pronouns. So you might hear me talk about form and function. I want you to see if you can identify or hopefully review the function of these different conditional sentences that I'm going to offer you as examples. In terms of the function itself, on your IELTS test, with your speaking and writing where you're producing language, you are graded upon that. Essentially, you're scored upon your accuracy. So function and form. The function means you're using the grammar in the right way with the right meaning. But in terms of your accuracy, form is really important. So let's start off with a zero conditional sentence. The function, right, in black here, the function, it's a general truth or what we believe to be true, right? Maybe something I think is true is not necessarily true, but I, the speaker, believe something to be true. And let me give you an example. Now, I am making a little prediction. I suspect that perhaps some of you might wonder why I'm using a government rather than the. Because in this case, with a conditional, it doesn't matter. We're not talking about any particular government. We're talking about any government, right? So good way to think about the difference between a and the, or a, an, and the, is when we use a or an, it's any. Right, so I could also say if any government, right, but that's not natural. So I say if our government spends more on education, average wages rise. Now, again, this is what I believe to be a general truth. Now, I did study economics, and I'm pretty sure it is an actual truth or a fact. But what I want you to do at home, can you identify the form, right? So we'll do that in blue. I'll start you off just so that you know what I'm talking about. So the form will be if plus a government subject. Right, so you can't have a grammar lesson without a little bit of form. So I really hope this helps you with your accuracy. Right, so what part of speech is spends, right? So with the verb forms, we have the base form. We have the past tense verb. And we have the past participle. Now, there may be various grammar books which will give a fourth form, and they may say that is the continuous form. That is another form which is often identified as well. So what I want you to do, which form is this, right? Is it a base verb? Is it the base verb form? Is it the past tense form? Is it the past participle form? Or is it continuous? If you have no idea what these forms mean, let me give you an example. Go, went, gone, going. So I hope that helps you to understand what I mean with all these different grammatical terms. We actually call this meta language. Meta language is the language of grammar, the language we use to describe language. So if your answer was base verb, well done. Now, in this case, we're adding an S, but I'm going to put this in brackets because obviously we don't need to always add an S. That's called subject-verb agreement. We're only going to add the S when we're talking about third person, when we're talking about third person singular, so he, she, or it. So in other words, the government could be it, right? So it's third singular, right? So now I can simplify this form and just say, well, here is the rest of this clause. So I'm only going to highlight subjects and verbs. And here we have the second clause, right? So this is the first clause. I'll just make it like that. And the second clause, we have another subject because there are two clauses. And average wages, we'll call that the subject. If you want it to be really particular, then it's actually wages. So I'll put that under here. So again, I've erased that, but hopefully you can remember base verb, past tense, past participle, or continuous verb. Which form of the verb is rise? And if your answer was base verb, well done. But remember, sometimes we might need an S because it's a third person singular, right? So that is the form for zero conditional. If you're frantically trying to scribble this all down at home, this will be replayed. Making notes is great, but at this stage, I would also probably suggest just trying to listen at the same time. But yeah, if you're a visual learner and you like writing, take some notes and just remember this will be uploaded, GRAID Facebook page, YouTube, also the GRAID website itself. So again, the function of zero conditional is a general truth. Now you may use this, if you think something is a general truth, you could use this structure, this conditional structure in your essays, perhaps when you speak. Let's move on to first conditionals. So again, just expanding upon the use of conditionals as an example of complex sentences to give you a bigger variety of grammar that you can use in the IELTS. First conditional. So obviously we're going to need if. Now, with first conditional sentences, we're talking about something in the future which is likely to happen, right? Or it could be our own intention. Could be a prediction, but this is just an easy way to think about it. I've tried to make these notes as simple as possible so that you can follow easily at home. But again, your challenge, here is the function. This means what we're using the structure for. What about the form? So I'll start you off again. It's if plus, right? So that bracket should actually be on this side. I can't remember how I represented it last time, but I think the bracket is better on the right-hand side of if. So children learn to read. Now, I'm actually going to represent the structure in a different way this time. Children learn to read is actually, so before I represented it as subject and base verb, we can actually call this simple present tense. Right? So some books might call this present simple tense. I've seen other books simple present tense. I think it doesn't matter. They mean the same thing. But essentially, simple present tense is subject and base verb. Sometimes it could be the use of the be verb. If it's the be verb, then it's going to be am, is, are, right? So, but that is the name of that form, right? So just to clarify, it's subject plus base verb, sometimes with S, right? Now, this is a particular structure which is known as an infinitive. I'm not going to get too complicated. So this is just a variation. Sometimes we can have verb to verb, but essentially present simple. At the least, it will have subject and a base verb, right? So we can just represent this clause here, right? So here is the clause before the comma, right? So here is the end of our first clause, which is denoted with a comma. Then we have the second clause here. And I've written up this sentence incorrectly. So, my mistake. Don't want to confuse you. This is the modal verb that I was looking for. Very important. This makes it a first conditional sentence. And as you can probably guess, the form is subject. I'm just going to say will in this case. This is an adverb, so we don't always need an adverb, but we do need base verb. Now, will could also be substituted with might, right? So obviously will, it's a strong prediction. Might is a possibility. But in most cases, will is the most commonly used modal verb that we use in first conditional. So I'm sorry before I left out will. I hope that didn't confuse you. So again, the function here, we're basically making a prediction or we're stating a likelihood. Now, you see here with second conditional, something's unreal, it's imagined. That's the big difference, right? So I have another question here. Okay, yeah, sorry, it was about will. Will was missing, right? So, yeah, I'm really sorry about that. So just remember, first conditional, we have will or might or may. So when you are using the grade side itself, in terms of this form, you're going to get some really good feedback with your writing in particular. The algorithm, the software which the grade site uses, it'll give you specific grammar feedback on the form or accuracy of your grammar, right? So let's move on to second conditional. And this is where I like to contrast second and first conditional, right? Just think, first conditional, you're saying something is likely, right? So I'm saying if children learn to read at an early age, they will usually do better at school, right? So I think that's likely. Second conditional, on the other hand, when you see my example, I'm sure you'll understand. And I've already used an example from the worksheets. You've seen one before. If I was the government. Now, not all second conditional sentences need to be about governments, don't get that wrong. If I was the government, I would censor, right? So means I would take out bits. I would censor extreme violence. So that's the bit I would take out in movies. Now, why is this unreal? Why is this imagined? Well, you probably can see by now I'm not the government, right? So we have to imagine. But there's a big difference here in form. Obviously, some people confuse the function sometimes. So again, first conditional is likely, second conditional is imagined, it's unreal. But there's a big difference in form. So I wonder if you can recognize the form. So remember, it's going to be if plus. Now, can you recognize what form this is? This is a big one. This is the most common mistake people make with second conditional. They use the incorrect form for this particular structure. So this is the dependent clause. And if you answered past simple, or simple past. Suit yourself how you want to call these things. Past simple or simple past tense. Well done. So obviously we have I, subject, and we're using the past tense form of be. Doesn't have to be the be verb, but in most cases, we're going to be using the be verb to imagine where somebody, well, the way I like to write, I like to imagine I'm somebody in that concluding sentence. So again, this is a recommendation that I might use, or I suggest you use at the end of your conclusion, right? Then for the second part, we have subject, and you heard me use the word modal before, right? Will is a modal, and then we have the base verb, right? There's never an S, right? When you have a modal, there's no subject-verb agreement. There's never an S, right? So in most cases, we're going to be using the modal would, which shows us that we're imagining something. It's a hypothetical, if you know that word. Other ones we could use could. Even might would work as well. But this is the most common one. So remember, this is imagined. Now, if you really want to show off to the examiner, you can talk about the past. So the third condition is a past impossibility. Now, in some cases, you could use a third conditional sentence also in your conclusion. You might talk about something you could have done. So listen to what I said, could have done in the past. We can't change the past unless you have a time machine. If you do, let me know. I would really like to go back and change the 2019 World Cup. But past impossibility, I'm going to give you an example, third conditional. So, now this is just an example. It's just one which I like to use to let you know that it's, it's one which is easy to remember. If I had traveled for a year before, so this is a double clause, before I entered university, so in this case, we have more than one clause in the first part of the sentence, right? So what we're going to do here, though, is we're going to focus the form on the first clause, right? We're just focusing on this part with the form. So we have a comma. I would have gained a better understanding of personal finances. Now, the reason I say this is just an example is because I am married and I do not need to have a good understanding of personal finances because that's what my wife tends to do. Maybe you're married and your wife does the same thing, but she's really good at that. But anyway, what I'm saying here is that we're talking about the past. Did I travel, right? So did I travel for a year? That's the first thing you need to think about. Did I travel for a year before I entered university? The answer to that question is no. So I have to imagine, right? I'm imagining a past. Obviously, I didn't travel for a year, so I'm imagining it, right? If I had traveled for a year before I entered university, and here is the outcome of that imaginary situation in the past. So these two are quite similar, right? Because essentially this is imagined because we can't change the past. So if I had traveled for a year before I entered university, I would have gained a better understanding of personal finances. So the form, this is a more complicated one. And if you can memorize this form and if you could incorporate this into your writing, I think it would demonstrate a fine understanding of grammar. So this is one definitely try to learn. You do not see this, or I don't see this being used very often, especially in the writing. It's if subject. Well, actually, for those who really know the grammar well, I wonder if you can recognize this particular structure. Just going to put my computer on. Now, if any of you have answered past perfect, well done. Past perfect is just had and then the past participle form, right? You'll notice with all of the sentences I compose, I'm using British spelling. That's the convention here in New Zealand. American spelling would just be with one L. So I know that some students have mentioned that. So it's past perfect, right? So you can even forget about this part here. And then it's plus subject, modal, have, and I'm just going to put PP because I think most students know what PP is, right? It's past participle, right? So again, very similar in meaning to second conditional, but the difference is with third conditional, we're talking about something in the past. And obviously we have to imagine that situation because we can't change the past. Now, mixed conditional is usually a combination of these two. Now, a lot of grammar books don't talk about mixed conditional, but it's something possibly you might use in your speaking tests in particular. Let me give you an example. So again, this is just an example. I actually feel fine at the moment, but this is a nice one which a lot of people can remember very easily. If I hadn't drunk so much last night, I wouldn't have a hangover. Now, a hangover is when you have a headache. You don't want one if you haven't had one. It's when you have a headache from drinking too much earlier, right? So two things to think about here. Remember, this is just an example. You know what? I'm just so I don't confuse you, I might even change this to John, right? So we're talking about somebody else. And then we'll say John, we'll say he, right? So first question for you to think about at home to understand the meaning of mixed conditionals. Did John drink a lot last night? Did John drink a lot last night? Yes, he did, right? But again, this is a mixed conditional. And the first part here, right? This clause here, which I'll underline in red, right, so here, we even have a time clause here, a time phrase. John cannot change the past. That's why we call it past impossibility. John cannot change the fact that he did drink a lot last night, right? So if your answer was yes, did John drink a lot last night? Well done. Now, the second part, does John have a hangover now? Does John have a hangover? If your answer is yes, well done. But you'll notice that I use the word now, right? So that's why it's a mixed conditional. There's an element of second conditional mixed with third conditional. And again, this is something you might possibly use on your speaking test. I'd say it's quite unlikely that you would use it on your writing test or in your essay. Perhaps if you're writing a letter, you might want to show off and try and incorporate a mixed conditional. But it's something which is overlooked because as a native speaker, This is quite a common one, right? Something we did in the past affects now, right? So I really hope this little bit of extra information on conditionals will help you to use a bigger range of conditional sentences in the writing and in your speaking tests. Let's move on with the worksheet. So I hope all of you diligent students are watching, all of you IELTS candidates can remember some of those subordinating conjunctions. It's been a while since we've looked at the variety. We've been focusing a lot on if, but I'll give you a chance at home. What about number 4? However, tenants will be faced with higher living costs. Their landlord increases the rent. Now, I'll give you a hint. We just spoke about these, right? So if your answer is if, well done. But to challenge you a bit further, which conditional sentence is this? Which conditional structure is this? Is it a zero conditional? Is it first, second, third, or is it mixed? So I would be checking the modal. And if you've identified the modal well done. This is a first conditional construction. And what you might also notice is that if can come in the middle of a sentence as well. Right? It doesn't always have to be at the start. So let's continue on to number 5. I can see somebody answered past perfect, so well done. I'm really glad you're following. And if you can recognize those basic tenses in English, that's really important. I say basic, I didn't say easy, I said basic. But English grammar is built upon those tenses. And what we're doing with a lot of the complex sentences is we're mixing in different tenses to give different meanings. What about here? Again, we have the dependent clause first because we have the comma, right? So the dependent clause is at the beginning. Okay, so blank. Well done for guessing first conditional. Well done. I can see somebody's belatedly answered first conditional. Yeah, but well done. Number 5, blank. Her daughter went to kindergarten. She started to develop social skills. So which subordinating clause do you think will fit into here? Now remember, for some of these questions, there could be more than one. So if your answer is before, well done. That is possible, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about that one in a second. It's possible, but I think these are probably more likely. Now, some of you might be really advanced with your grammar, and you might say, if you use before, then this should actually be past perfect, right? So to give you an understanding of how past perfect works, I'll put it up here. So we have now, then we have a time in the past. Right, now with past perfect, it's an event which happens before, so we don't know exactly when is not important, but the past perfect event happens at another time, before another time in the past. Now, if you prescribe to English, well, particularly British-centric grammar, then you might say that this should actually be past perfect, right? So but the reason I say that that's not necessarily right or wrong is because what you'll find is with a lot of American speakers and users of English, they don't actually use past perfect as British, well, as a lot of British users do. So that's why I said for many of you, it could be very natural to have before as the answer here without past perfect. Whereas others may be watching saying, if you have before, then this should be past perfect. Not necessarily. English is a very widely spoken, widely used language, and there are variations. So that sort of thing here is just one of those variations of the different Englishes. Personally, as a New Zealand speaker, I find it quite easy to sort of have a bit of flexibility between the two big Englishes being British and American. So if you spotted that, well done. If those were your answers as well, you're definitely on the right track. So we're talking about a time clause here, right? As an example of a complex sentence. Number 6. Now, this I would actually recognize as being quite possibly the most difficult question that I've given you. If you have filled in the blank here with this answer, well, I'll give you a bit more time because I think you might need to think a bit more about this one. Now, let me start by giving the answer I think a lot of you will have, but it's incorrect. Now, if you have answered if, you're on the right track. So I'll make that clearer for you because, okay. If you have answered if, it's wrong. So I'm going to cross it out in red so you can still see it clearly. It doesn't make sense, right? So you're on the right track though, because you're obviously recognizing that it's a first conditional construction. But if global warming is immediately curbed means reduced or stopped, you know, like if global warming is stopped, sea levels will continue to rise. That doesn't really make factual sense, right? So if global warming is curbed, we would hopefully expect sea levels to stay the same and not rise. So that's why I think if is not the best answer, or not even the correct answer. If you have answered unless, then you are doing extremely well, right? So the easiest way to think about unless is it's if not, right? So it's the opposite of if, right? It's the negation, the negative of if, right? So another way of saying that, if global warming is not immediately curbed, that has the same meaning as unless, right? So it's not a word which a lot of learners I hear using often, but again, just to add some variety into your writing and speaking, it's one which you can start using more often. And the easiest way to think about it is the opposite of if, right? It's the negation, it's the negative. Somebody is suggesting although. This is not a contrast, right? So, and in that case, if you were to say although, I would probably use past perfect. Although global warming has been curbed, right? That might be the contrast. So that's a good, you're on the right track. But I think if I were to use although, I would use present perfect. Although global warming has been curbed, that would create a better contrast, right? Or you could even use continuous. Although global warming is being curbed, sea levels will continue to rise. But in this case, I've actually designed it as an example of unless. But I'm really glad that you're considering using a contrast as well. Again, with that contrast, I would probably use a different tense. Okay, I've given you some really long sentences to process. Hopefully, you know, you can take my model sentences and you know, use those as models for your own writing as well. But the focus here, again, what's the subordinating conjunction that's missing? Juveniles are especially influenced by violence in the media. Blank, what's missing? It is difficult to regulate. Again, we've gone through a few of these. I hope you have a lot of these subordinated conjunctions in your mind now. And if your answer for this one was because, well done. But I want you to think of two other conjunctions which we could use instead of because. And I'll give you a hint. One of them begins with S. Another one begins with A. So again, this is where I think you should start trying to mix up the use of because there we go, I'm using because too often. Okay, just thinking ahead to due to. In this case, since and as would be interchangeable. Now, we were offered the example or the other option of due to by an avid viewer, so well done. In this case, due to would not fit with the next clause. So I've tried to use a bit of a disclaimer and say that in most cases, due to could be used interchangeably. In this case, we can't use due to with the be verb construction, right? So in most cases, due to we can use instead of because, but there are exceptions to that. So, but since and as almost always they're interchangeable. Number 8. Okay. We're missing a subordinate subordinator here. Tenants may find it easier to move and they have a wider choice of houses. Renting a home, so I'll give you the correct intonation. So something, tenants may find it easier to move and they have a wider choice of houses. Renting a home is more expensive and there are more restrictions, right? So if you watched webinar 3, where I talked about advantages, disadvantages essays, hopefully you can remember the particular subordinating conjunction I used. And if you remember while, well done. And I'm going to underline that just again to show you that there is a slight difference. And if you have the answers although, or though, or even though, now while doesn't show as greater contrast well, the way I use while. These other subordinating conjunctions, although, though, and even though, they show a stronger contrast. Why do I use while? I think it's just my habit. And hopefully, as you progress with your English learning, with your acquisition of English, you'll start developing habits as well. You know, these are the kind of natural phrases which we like to use. In my case, I just like beginning sentences as a contrast with while. These ones here are fine. All of these answers are correct or possible. So we've got a couple more to go. So I'm really glad to see that there's some contributions. People are offering some answers here. 2 more that we're going to cover. Again, all of these are from essays, or the content are from essays which I've covered in previous webinars. But another example, this was from a webinar about violence in the media affecting juveniles, right? So juveniles, teenagers, if you remember, just a bit of vocab review. Movies can also model violent behavior to teenagers. What's missing from here? The government has imposed age restrictions upon them, right? Now, if your answer is although, well done. If your answer is though, Well done. If your answer is even though, well done. Now, this is where I really hope I don't confuse you. But if your answer is while, no. Let me explain. Again, although, though, and even though are used to show a strong contrast. Think about while has the same meaning as on one hand, on the other hand, right? So while here doesn't really make sense because we want to show a strong contrast, right? So movies can also model violent behavior to teenagers, right? So that's what's happening or what could happen, even though the government has imposed age restrictions upon them, right? So this one thing has happened and the government obviously hoped that the teenagers wouldn't be exposed to violent behavior. So there's a strong contrast here. All of those show a strong contrast. While doesn't show a strong contrast. It's more like the meaning of on one hand, on the other hand, right? So that's an easy way to think about while. And the last one for today, another one which relates to the essay that we did on early reading skills. Most children have memorized the alphabet. Now, this is a tough one as well. This is a set phrase, and it relates to this part here. This is a set phrase. This means a group of words which have to be used together. There's only one answer for this. And if the answer is by, if your answer is by, well done. So most children have memorized the alphabet by the time, right? So I'm going to flip back to those subordinating conjunctions. Right, so here, by has to come with by the time, right? So, sorry, I should even write that up. But anyway, by the time. Sometimes it can be used by itself, but in this case, it's part of the set phrase, right? So it can be used independently without the time, but in this case, by the time is that set phrase. So just looking ahead, and what I'm going to do on Thursday is I'm going to look back and reflect upon WH clauses. Those were, well, these are the garden variety, the two clause type use of complex sentences. But in previous webinars, I've talked about WH clauses. I think I also have used the expression relative clauses as well. So most people consider them to be other forms of complex sentences. We're going to look at those on Thursday. So just to preview. Thursday, WH clauses and relative clauses. Again, most grammarians, most people that study grammar consider those to be complex sentences as well. The kinds that I've given you now, I was really focusing on ones which highlight that use of independent and dependent clauses. But I want to give you as much of a range of grammar as possible. So we're going to recap WH clauses. And I'm going to contrast those with relative clauses because a lot of people make a mess of the form, right? A lot of people confuse the form of these two. So I thought it's good I like to teach them at the same time. Because if you understand these, you can understand these easily, then you can use them on your test. One other thing I wanted to point out, and you've heard me say this several times in previous webinars, this is also a complex sentence which you should be using a lot. I think that, right? So That's a really simple one. And you've heard me say with this relative pronoun after a verb of thinking or saying, right? So we have two clauses and one of them is essentially dependent upon the other. Highlight that to the examiner, right? Because this is a relative, this is a sentence where the relative pronoun is not necessary. And some candidates actually drop it. I would say just keep it in there, just to highlight that you're using a relative clause with a thinking or saying verb, right? A complex sentence, sorry. So most people consider this also to be a complex sentence. Again, we're going to look at some other ways of using a wider range of grammar, some what most people consider to be complex sentences, WH clauses, relative clauses on Thursday. The time, same schedule, same schedule, whether you're using American or British English. It's always Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, 1:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, where I know so many of you are watching, which is 8 p.m. here in New Zealand. So again, Thursday, this Thursday, we're going to do WH clauses and relative clauses. Looking ahead to Sunday, we're going to cover the passive voice, which is a really useful grammatical structure to be using in your writing, as we have looked at and touched upon before. I hope this was helpful. What you'll also be able to find now, if you go to the GRAID website, these questions will be live. So if you want to do a review now or later, you'll have the ability to input your answers and get some self-checking, right? So a bit of self-study that you can do on the GRAID website. If you don't know what that is, check it out. So please stay safe. There's the GRAID website. Please stay safe. And I look forward, here in lockdown for a bit longer here in New Zealand too, to seeing you on Thursday. Take care.